What exactly is frequency? Frequency is closely related to the period of a graph. So I have three sine functions, each of which has a different period, but otherwise is just kind of a typical negative 1 to 1 sine graph, no change in phase, displacement, amplitude, or sinusoidal axis. So let's just look at the first one. So this first graph has a period of 2 pi divided by pi over 2, which is just 4. So that means this is just a little sine graph that completes its entire cycle in 4 units. So this would be 4 and 2 and 1 and 3. Okay, so we can say the period means that there are 4 units in one cycle. So one complete cycle of the graph takes 4 units to complete. Now the frequency says that there is 1/4 of a cycle per 1 unit. So we can see that if we look at 1 unit of the graph, there would be 1 unit. 1 unit contains 1/4 of the cycle of the graph. So the period and the frequency are reciprocals of each other. Period equals 4, frequency equals 1/4. Period tells me units per cycle. And let me write that a little better. It's kind of hard for me to write at the bottom here. Period tells me units per cycle. Let me write that as a fraction. Sorry, I'm messing this up so many times. Units per cycle. And frequency tells me cycles per unit. Okay, now you might think, why would I want to know that there's 1/4 cycle per unit? Well, you probably wouldn't. In this case, it's easier to talk about the period. But we're going to look at a couple more examples where it makes more sense to see what this frequency does. So this next one, the period is equal to 2 pi over 4 pi, because now b is 4 pi, or 1/2. So this tells me then that the graph completes one cycle in 1/2 unit. Okay, so whatever those units happen to be. So that means that the period tells me that there is 1/2 unit per cycle. The frequency then tells me that there are 2 cycles per unit. In other words, if I were to draw this graph and this is 1/2 unit and this is 1 whole unit, the graph is going to repeat itself 2 complete cycles in 1 unit, since it completes 1 cycle in half a unit. So this kind of makes more sense now, 2 cycles per unit. So let's say the units are in some increment of time, like seconds. So this is telling me 2 cycles per second. So if we say that's a second, and this is a half second. So 1 cycle takes a half a second to complete, 2 cycles per second. Now, where this actually comes in handy even more is when we're dealing with frequencies that occur in nature. So this is an example of an equation that would represent a sound wave. Sound travels through the air at a fairly rapid pace. So when we talk about the period, we're talking about how many seconds it takes for 1 cycle to complete or to go past. So if you're like measuring a sound at a certain spot, how many cycles of sound go past you at that spot in so many seconds. So the period here is equal to 400 pi, or sorry, 2 pi divided by 400 pi. 2 pi divided by 400 pi, which is 1 over 200, which is equal to 0.005. So let's say this is in seconds. So we're saying it takes 0.005 seconds for one cycle of a sound wave to pass by. Now that's a really small period. So it actually makes more sense to report the frequency of the sound. And you've probably heard of frequency of sound. The frequency would be 200 over 1, or 200 cycles per second. And there's actually a unit, special unit, cycles per second, which is called hertz, 200 hertz. But 200 cycles per second. That means if you stand at a certain spot and you count sine waves as they go by, 200 complete sound waves are going to go by in 1 second. Now that's basically the type of waves that occur in nature. Sound waves, light waves, electromagnetic waves, radio waves, those kind of things are going to have a very high frequency and a very small period. And the difference in frequency will give you information about that sound. So hopefully this helps you understand a little bit more. So for example, if I were to make this go from 0 to 1 here, there would be 200 complete cycles of a sine or cosine wave that would go by, in this case sine, that would go by, that would fit in that interval, which would be really hard to draw, obviously. So up and down, 200 times in 1 second. So that's the difference between frequency and period.